This book I read entitled Lying is fascinating, especially the basic premise, which reeled me in right away, is that we often behave in ways that are guaranteed to make us unhappy. And lying itself is so common, people do it without even thinking. We don't even know what life would be like without it. And some of the analogies are quite brilliant. We wouldn't want a car that told us we don't need gas when we really do, just because we're too lazy to stop. So why would we want that in our lives? And yet this is what most people seem to be doing.
Yeah, well, where it gets controversial is on the topic of white lies. So most people acknowledge that there's a problem, or at least a potential problem, with lying in general, where you're the head of a company and you're lying about your financials, you're engaged in a fraud, you're Lance Armstrong and you're taking steroids and you're having press conferences and lying about it and lying about your teammates and, suing them to shut them up when they tell the world that you're lying. And I mean, so it's like all of that seems pathological, and most people recognize that that's worth avoiding if you can at all help it. But they nevertheless reserve the right to lie on all these other occasions where they think it's actually a good thing to do and a compassionate thing to do and a thing that is actually improving their relationships rather than undermining them. They call these white lies. So much of the book is, as you know, is purposed toward arguing against this very notion of a white lie. I think if you look closely at the circumstances where you think you are doing yourself or anyone else a favor by misleading another person about what you actually believe to be true, you're not. And you can discover that what you're doing is quite obviously motivated by an interpersonal fear with that person, and you're in some sense ramifying that fear and allowing your relationship to conform to it. Whenever you're found out, you're diminishing the trust in the relationship, the trust that the other person could possibly have in you, even if they were consoled by your white lie when you told it. One of my favorite examples in the book, I released that book as an ebook first. It was just a very short hardcover book, but initially it was just a PDF that I released. And then I got reader feedback. I had readers tell me their stories about lies that had misfired for them and the price they had paid for lying or the lies of others in their lives. And one story that came in, which I used in the subsequent edition of the book, was of two women who were out to lunch, and one said to the other, brought up a third friend, and one said, "Oh yeah, I'm supposed to see her tonight, but I just can't do it. I'm so busy. I don't want to go out. I'm going to call her and just tell her I can't go out tonight." So in the presence of her friend, she gets on her phone, calls this third person, and gets her voicemail and just lies about why she can't have dinner that night. She says something about her kids being sick or whatever, in the presence of this other friend. And so now this story was delivered to me by this friend who just watched her friend lie with just perfect alacrity to a friend at kind of at the same level, and recognized in that moment that it just subtly but rather fatally diminished her trust in her friend. I mean, she just wondered immediately, she couldn't help but wonder how often she had been on the receiving end of that kind of treatment. What was so insidious about this is that it was not the kind of lie, nor was it the kind of friendship that required that she say anything. So she never communicated that she perceived this to be an ethical problem or this had harmed their relationship. And so the person who was lying never knew that she had just sort of lost a friend to some degree. I mean, all of this is just so corrosive and so uninspected by most people. And so that's where the book focuses.
Yeah, the book is fascinating in that it explains how lying damages trust, how it never needs to be done. Light deception versus lying. I mean, you don't have to tell, "Hey, how you doing?" "Well, I've got a little bit of bowel dysfunction today. It's going like this." You can sort of separate that between why we can't make your birthday party or why Lisa can't hang out. It's fascinating that you also get into the idea, which I think marketers and online personalities do a lot, and now, of course, the layman through social media, we deliberately allow others to draw erroneous conclusions all the time. And you've even separated the act of commission versus act of omission and how one is punished more than the other. I would love to talk about things like candor and why candor doesn't necessarily equal truth, and measuring truthfulness. That's almost impossible to do this without a lot of deep thought, which you have mostly done.
So the commitment to telling the truth, it's definitely not the commitment to being totally uncensored and lacking in all tact. I mean, it's not like you need to become a Tourette's patient and just blurt out whatever's on your mind. It's not to say that that is actually the phenomenology of Tourette syndrome, but that's the cartoon version of it. But it's a commitment to saying what's true and useful. The filter is true and useful. And there are certain circumstances where I think, are wise to worry. First of all, there is no whole truth. I mean, you can't say everything you think about anything. You'd be there forever, right? So you're always picking and choosing things to say. And there are circumstances where I would admit that a slightly more paternalistic view of the person you're talking about is relevant. So that if you're talking to a child, if your 7-year-old asks you, what is ISIS? You don't have to immediately start telling her about all the decapitations happening in the Middle East. There's a reason to edit the truth, and it doesn't require any lying. It just requires that you see that there's certain, blanks on the map that are not appropriate to fill in for a 7-year-old. And there are grown-ups who occasionally have to be treated like children, but we should recognize that that's in fact what we're doing. If you think someone really can't handle the truth about their life. You think this person's going to commit suicide if you tell him that, that his wife is cheating on him or that you didn't like his novel or something. Well, then you have to acknowledge that you're dealing with someone who you think, rightly or wrongly, is not a fully competent interlocutor. I mean, this is somebody who you are protecting from himself. Those are really unique circumstances when you're talking about adults. I mean, far more often, we're just uncomfortable communicating what is true because we don't think it makes us look very good. It puts us in an awkward situation. And so we're protecting ourselves, or imagine we're protecting ourselves. We're not giving the other people, in many cases, an honest look at what our situation actually is and what our relationship actually is and what they can expect from us in the future and the kinds of friendships we want to have with them. And there's a mismatch between their expectation and what, in fact, you intend to do the next time you're in a room with them. So if someone's sending you emails about, wanting to get together for lunch and you just simply don't want to have lunch with this person and you don't want this kind of relationship with this person and you don't even like this person and they don't know it, right? I would grant you that there are more and less tactful, more and less polite ways to resolve that situation. But the thing that most people do is they just punt. They tell a white lie. They say, I'm just really busy this week. Sorry, I just can't do it. And then, you get an email from that person next week. At a certain point, you either have to confront this or you just keep making up more elaborate lies and hope they get the point. If you want to live your life with integrity, I mean, just look at what integrity means. Integrity is a closeness of fit between what you will say to someone's face and what you will say about them when they leave the room. If there's a real distance there, one, you're not a good friend, if that person is in fact your friend, but also you're a scary person for others to be around. We've all been this person. We've occupied each one of these roles. You know what it's like when someone leaves the room and the people who are left immediately start talking about them. When you see someone say something that there's no way they would say that in the presence of the person who has left, you know that this person is advertising to you something about themselves, I think diminishes your trust of them. What are they saying about you behind your back? And yet the person who's dishing now about the other person is rarely aware that this is in fact what's happening. They're rarely aware that they are advertising their capacity to, stab others in the back. I mean, there are many people who I will say terrible things about because I think terrible things about them, but I will also say these things to their face. I've worked very hard to do that. I can't say that, honestly, there's no difference between how I would speak about someone to their face and behind their back, but there's much less difference than there ever has been in my life. And certainly there's much less than I see in the lives of others. And there's an immense power to that. You can be overheard by anyone and be unembarrassed. And it also forces you to confront your mind as it actually is. I mean, if you're a petty, judgmental, self-serving asshole, forcing yourself to be honest with other people holds a mirror up to that side of your life very, very quickly. If the truth about why you don't want to go out with someone, right, is that you only want to date people who are 15 years younger than yourself and look like they're, fitness models, well, that's a truth you have to confront if you don't give yourself the out about lying. If you can't have recourse to, well, sorry, I just don't feel like being in a relationship now, whatever the lie is, it's something that you actually do have to confront about yourself, whereas the liar need, in fact, never even notice it or never see its implications.
Do you think this is more of a epidemic as of lately in the last few decades, as it has been in, say, the several decades ago, the 50s, 40s, 30s, where people were more straight up honest? I mean, it seems the what's going on campuses right now, what it's more important to watch people's feelings than to be honest with them.
I think this is more or less just a constant in human relationship. The moment we acquired the facility to represent the world in language and express our beliefs, acquire new ones, and modify the beliefs of others in conversation, I think we very quickly learned to lie and noticed that in certain circumstances there was a real benefit to lying. But one place where I do reserve the right to lie, in any circumstance where I would otherwise also act in a way that would seem unethical, and where I would use violence, like in a self-defense situation. If you're in a situation where you could punch someone in the face and call it self-defense, well, then obviously you could also lie to that person as a lesser act of violence. So I think we've always seen the utility of manipulating one another with lies. And then there's just all of these cultural artifices that we've acquired since, which, depending on what culture you're in, have dignified certain kinds of lies, necessary for appropriate, social relations. So you're being polite when you're telling that particular kind of lie. Certain ones of these are still hard to get around, and I'm not especially dogmatic about this. You brought up one when you raised this topic. We talk about just the nature of greeting somebody, where they say, how are you doing? And you say, oh, I'm great, fine, how are you? You realize that the question isn't what it seems to be. It's not that they really want to know about the state of your bowels or whether you slept last night or how your marriage is going. They're just saying hi. This is just in your language. This is how you say hi. Say, how's it going? In another relationship, it would be a lie to say you're fine if, in fact, you're miserable and, you're now talking to your wife or someone very close to you who actually does want to know day in and day out how your life is going. There are things that can seem like lies on the surface, which in fact aren't lies, because what's really being asked is people are asking you to perform a kind of ritual. But for the most part, I think it's just a constant and differs from culture to culture. I don't know that it's actually gotten worse in any way in our lifetime. I think one thing that's gotten better is it's harder to successfully lie if you're at all a public person, because nothing disappears on the internet. Everyone is just trailing, more or less everything they've ever said or written, and now for all time that this is going to be the case. So you can just look to see what the person said on that occasion. And some great examples of people lying and then being caught, or lying about what others have done and then being caught. There's a video record of the very event they're talking about. I think that's very useful. I think the more sensitized people get to the prospect of being caught in their lies, that will make for a better society just across the board.
Right. It causes different behavior. I mean, I read the book, and I've done this before in years past. I monitor how often I tell things like white lies, and I realized, wow, I do this a lot more than I think I do. And the reason is to make things easier for us in the short term, easier for me and them, frankly, in the short term, friends, family, etc. But once you stop, you start to see, well, people might see me as brash, but in the end, they appreciate it. And like you said, it makes you almost scandal-proof, because weakness comes in pretending to be somebody, especially if you're a public figure, that you are not. And it makes you the bad kind of vulnerable. And the honesty that you mentioned before can really force any dysfunction, any sort of thing that's wrong in your intimate life to come to the surface. The example in the book, if you're in an abusive relationship, if you won't lie to others, and they ask how you got that bruise or why you look terrible or things like that, I mean, it would cause you to come to grips with the situation very quickly. Drugs, alcohol addiction, lying is really a key component of addiction that goes untreated. And if you have no recourse to lying about things, you can really unravel things early enough to maybe make the damage not so severe.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I've experienced that in many ways. And just to go back to something you just said, though, about making it easier for yourself and easier for the other person in the moment, it's worth lingering on just the conception of easier for the other person for a moment, because it's often making it easier in the sense that you're telling them what they want to hear, or telling them something more pleasant than is in fact what's true. But you might also be causing them to waste a tremendous amount of time or encouraging them to waste a tremendous amount of time where you could be helping them to get their life on track in a way that other people around them aren't. So the classic example for me is when someone asks you to give your opinion of their book or their screenplay or something they've been working on. So let's say you read their book and you think it's terrible. Obviously, it'd be much more convenient for both of you if you read their book and you thought it was great, because then you can say it was great and then you feel good and they feel good and your friendship is intact and there's no problem. But if a friend of yours comes to you with something they've spent a lot of time working on and you think it's terrible, if you think you're helping them by sparing them this momentary discomfort of you not supporting their rosiest conception of themselves, I think you really need to look more closely at that, because I've been on both sides of this. And I can tell you that the people who didn't give me honest feedback or just didn't have good critical feedback to give were far less helpful to me than the people who said, listen, you have to tear this thing down to the studs. This is awful. You're lucky only I saw this. Other people who aren't their friends are not going to spare them their criticism. The way to think about it in these cases of creative work, what you're doing for your friend is this thing is not yet out in the world, right? It's a different circumstance when it's out in the world and there's nothing they can do about it. Then you're having a different conversation, which is arguably harder. But if you're still in a position to give them some help by giving them honest feedback, then you really should give that feedback. And you can always give it in a way that acknowledges that it's just your opinion. You're not omniscient. You're not the ultimate arbiter of what is good in the world. But if you have an informed opinion and you have reason to think that other people are going to share your view of the things they're getting wrong, well, then you should really just be candid. And if the person you're dealing with is at all an adult and actually wants to be spared future embarrassment, well, then they're going to be grateful for your candor. And they're actually going to find the friends who just glad-handed them and sent them on their way totally useless. It's always interesting to look back on the praise one received for things that one now thinks were terrible. Imagine you've got two friends. You're doing something you really hope is going to be great. You show it to two friends, and the first friend tells you, oh, everything that's wrong with this, and it's going to take you a lot of effort to make it right, but you got to get in there and do it because in its present form, this thing is terrible. And you wind up agreeing with him, right? And you do the work and you make all those improvements. But you have this other friend who saw your first draft and said, I think it's great. That person is far less valuable to you in that capacity. And it would be an irony if the person was simply lying to you, thinking he was going to spare you some discomfort.
I think if you were going to ask for that criticism, then you have to be honest and wanting to hear real criticism.
There are people who ask what you think, and they actually don't want to know, right? These people are functioning like children in a way. The one thing that happens once you become more and more committed to being honest is you train the people in your life. They know what to expect from you. I don't find people coming to me anymore who don't actually want to know what I think. And that's also very helpful. And then people return the favor. If you're someone who was really honest in criticizing what somebody was doing, and then you need criticism of your own work, well, then you can get it. There are people who are locked and loaded and ready to return in kind. At a certain point, you're desperate for this because it's just, why would you want anything else? You're not going to be spared this feedback once you go public with your work.
It goes back to what you're saying. When we lie to people, we treat them like children because it fails to prepare them for encounters with others, the public, for example, who will treat them like adults and won't be as kind to spare their feelings short term. And research shows, even in our own intimate relationships, that lies are correlated with less satisfying relationships. So that short term over long term, like you and I have both discovered firsthand, and me especially more recently after having read the book, once you commit to telling the truth, you start to realize how rare it is. You start to realize that, wow, I only know a few people who will tell me the truth about their truth about pretty much anything. And honest people's opinions become worth more because they're trusted. To link this back to Art of Charm principles, it is better to be trusted than merely liked because it's easy enough to get people to like you. It's hard to get people to trust you. One is certainly, in my opinion, more valuable than the other.
Oh, yeah. Trust is certainly in this domain, and we're talking about relationships that matter. And again, we started talking about people who've managed to function really with a different kind of currency of trust. I mean, someone like Trump, they're trusting him to be himself, but they're really not trusting him beyond that because it's impossible. What he's saying can't be squared with what he said 5 minutes ago. Trust is the most important thing here. And one thing that I'm happy about with respect to my own audience, in large measure, the result of having written that book, Lying, I've gone on record as someone who just doesn't lie. And I now have a core audience of people who really are engaged with my work, who have just the shortest fuse imaginable with respect to any perceived inconsistency or lack of intellectual honesty on my part. I've got the anti-Trump audience. These are people, the irony here is that I'm often accused of having a cult of followers who will just take my side in any argument, will just flame people on social media in ways that are not warranted. But what in fact I have is many core readers and listeners to my podcast who just have zero tolerance for what they perceive as a contradiction or intellectual dishonesty on my side. I love that. It's a bit of a hassle because often these people are perceiving a contradiction where there isn't one, or I simply misspoke, or there's some glitch just gets magnified because everyone is just watching really keeping score in a very rigorous way. But I really do love it because what's being said to me again and again under this guise is, people really trust me. And that's the most important thing. And if I break that trust, I'm screwed. I'm happy that I have kind of taken my conversation on this topic so far in that direction that hypocrisy there will not be tolerated.
What about relationships with friends, spouses, and even family that are essentially really, really difficult to maintain without lying? I think a lot of people have relationships like this, even if it's just, you got to keep telling Angela she's pretty because they're propping up her self-esteem. I've got to keep telling Jordan he looks good in those pants or whatever. What do we do about those relationships? Do we sever ties or do we just start being honest right away and deal with the consequences?
I think you can move it in the direction of more and more honesty, however incrementally, and deal with the consequences. And certainly if the relationship is important, it should be important to improve it in whatever way you can. I acknowledge that there are circumstances where this is just not practical. Basically, you have one Thanksgiving dinner a year with these people, and your job is just not to ruin it. You're not going to change anybody. You're not going to perform an exorcism that's going to make your aunt or uncle a fundamentally different person. But in those cases, I think you can just be tactful. You can change the topic. You can just simply not comment on things that you might have a lot to say about. And so being political in that sense and just being wise to avoid specific issues is not the same as lying. And even keeping a secret is not the same as lying. If someone says to you, how much money do you have in your bank account, or asks you to divulge information that you actually don't want to divulge, the truth is you don't want to tell them. So you can say, listen, I don't want to tell you. I don't give that information out. So you can be perfectly honest and withhold certain things. You can also be honest and just not get into certain conversations with people where it's not going to go well. It's good to play with the uncomfortable edge of this a little bit and be more honest than people might expect you to be. What's important in those circumstances, certainly in relationships that matter, where you're actually trying to maintain a good relationship with this person, you're on the same team. This is not an adversarial form of honesty. You're trying to have a better relationship. There's a psychological cost that you are paying for having to conceal how you really feel about something in this person's presence. And you don't want to pay that cost anymore because you want to have a better relationship with them. You respect them too much, or you love them too much, or you're like, this is intolerable, that this is so weird that you can't talk about how you feel about X, Y, and Z with your mom or whoever it is, because you're so busy sparing her feelings, because she is such a brittle person that she has just endlessly advertised to you that if you say the wrong thing about X, Y, and Z, she's going to go berserk, right? So you can either try to improve all that, or you can treat this person as an adversary in some sense. I'm not saying adversaries don't exist, but then what you have to acknowledge is that you are in large measure avoiding relationship with that person. They're the kind of person that is incapable of an honest relationship. And you can't cut all those people out of your life. I mean, certainly you can't cut your mom out of your life, or you shouldn't be eager to. you can decide who to spend time with. Obviously, you want to spend time with people who you don't have to do that with.
Especially given the psychological cost of lying, having to then keep track of lies and other people's lies if we're complicit with their lies. You mentioned in the book as well, there's a psychological process where we actually devalue people that we lie to in order to rationalize our own behavior. Like they matter less subconsciously because we're willing to lie to them. Therefore, the reason we're willing to lie to them is because, well, they matter less. They're less important, or they're less evolved, or they're less salient in our own lives. And that can be very toxic. The willingness to be honest about things we might otherwise conceal is a really strong foundation for great rapport and relationships with others. At Art of Charm, one of the AOC core skill sets, we're talking about vulnerability when it comes to generating rapport with other people. People bond very strongly on insecurities when shared, almost like a superpower, to be strong enough to tell people the truth about yourself. The reactions that you get from other people who find this so refreshing and powerful can have ripple effects around you and your social and intimate circles.
Yeah, and that's another one of these blind spots that people think that being vulnerable is a position of weakness and it's unattractive. And so they conceal their vulnerabilities. It's like the opposite of the name dropping example I gave you. So from the inside, you don't like feeling vulnerable. You want to hide this about yourself. You don't want people to see it. So it's the last thing in the world you're going to do is tell a story where, you have to reveal what a schmuck you are. As you say, it's once you get to the other side of that, where you see how much enjoyment you get from other people's exposing this about themselves. And you see, whole careers are built on nothing more than a person's ability to expose their most vulnerable parts. Again, this can cross over into shtick and become just performance. But, obviously, comedians and other beloved entertainers are often beloved precisely because they're just like performing a perpetual autopsy on their failures. And that's how they're succeeding in life. It is a kind of superpower to just have nothing that's going to embarrass you. I mean, again, this is where integrity is worth meditating on for a moment. When there is no distance between who you are in private and who you are in public, there really is no capacity for embarrassment. If you're not concealing something about yourself that you're hoping others will not notice, you're not trying to foist any illusions on people about you, but you're simply just of a piece and living your life, honestly representing your views and willing to talk about anything. That's a kind of superpower. It's just so rare. Again, I certainly can't say I've perfectly achieved it. I know what the bullseye looks like, and I know when I land in it, and I know when I land just outside it. And, just as a matter of ethics and a matter of just personal growth, I think it's useful to become less and less comfortable with one's own duplicity, being two-faced and saying the thing to the person's face and having something very different to say when they leave the room. All of those dichotomies, ultimately, I think we should find them intolerable. There's a lot of strength that comes from that.
What about lying on a cultural level, like lies in public discourse, for example, which have led to ridiculous conspiracy theories and rampant distrust of authority? It seems now, and you mentioned this a little bit earlier, we can't even talk about serious things like climate change and going back to originally what we were mentioning, nutrition, because we don't even trust the scientists and the experts now. It's become almost a cultural phenomenon in which you just expect everybody's totally full of it.
Yeah, well, a part of that is just having the incentives misaligned, the conflicts of interest. And we know that this confounds people's ability to reason honestly, and we need a system that corrects for that. And science, taken in its totality, does correct for vested interests and wishful thinking and even fraud. The consequence of public lies, the consequence of governments lying and corporations lying and individual scientists lying and getting away with it for some period of time, it's just enormous. It's incredibly toxic. And this distrust of authority, or not being able to figure out who the actual authorities are on any given topic, it's a real problem. It's just there's a kind of nihilism that creeps into the public conversation on really consequential issues that is, if taken seriously, just a perfect impediment to getting anything of value happening in the world. People who think that it's basically no such thing as truth, or that it just doesn't matter what the truth is, or you can make up any truth that you find consoling. The influence of conspiracy theory thinking, so much of the public on any given topic, it's very harmful. Paradoxically, the internet has both enabled it and provided an antidote simultaneously. It's much easier to debunk lies given the internet, but it's also much easier to wall yourself off in a echo chamber that's filled with almost nothing but lies and just stay there and never have any other way of thinking impinge on you, because you've basically just curated your ignorance and misunderstanding. You have all the tools to do it.